All right, so everybody knows the drill. And Chris, this is, some more people will be coming in. This is a speaker series for kind of parallel to our Introduction to Latinx Studies class, to get to know the Latinx community here in New Orleans. You are going to be talking about your literature, being a writer, also a little bit, and I told the students they could do this in the Q&A. Since you are from Hialeah, we read a couple of articles about Cubans voting in South Florida, and a particularly interesting article about Hialeah. I told them that perhaps you'd be willing to answer any questions about that. But you know, your presentation will be about your literature. So y'all, I've known Christopher. I first met Christopher New Orleans. I don't know if even Christopher knows this, but New Orleans has used to have a fringe festival. So we used to have this kind of performative arts festival all over the Marigny, all over the Bywater. They would have performances, readings in different nooks and crannies all around this area of New Orleans. And I went to Christopher's reading that was held in the bar across the street from the Phoenix. It wasn't Mags, it was behind Mags.
Yeah.
In this little kind of room. And I think I walked up and introduced myself to him. I'm not sure if I did, but I don't know how long ago that was, maybe 8 years ago?
Yeah.
Maybe less.
I think it was 13.
Okay, so 7 years ago. Christopher graduated from FIU in Miami. He just graduated with an MFA from the University of New Orleans. He's published in, and you guys had this in his bio, right? He's published in Curb National, The Daily Beast, PANK Magazine, the New Orleans Review, and is a Cuban-American. I've also had the pleasure of being in Cuba with Christopher, not this past summer, but the summer before. So we've actually spent a lot of time together. So please, Christopher, go ahead. Tell us, tell us a little bit about yourself first, if you want to start off, and then tell us a little bit about being a writer and being a Latinx writer.
No, it's interesting that you mentioned where we met, because I think that was my second reading ever in New Orleans. So that was like the beginning of my New Orleans writing career. And then just to speak on the cat, whenever mi abuela is mad at me, she calls me Camilo Sin Fuego because of the beard and the, so I hear you. Kalina did a really good job of introducing me in that way. I was born in Hialeah, Florida. My parents decided to go to that hospital because at the time that was a hospital known for having like the most Cuban doctors. And so they wanted somebody who they can relate to a little bit more. I was their first child. My sister, who is in the Tulane PhD program and the smarter of us, was also born in that hospital. But yeah, I was born there and I was raised in South Miami, Kendall area. To put a perspective on Hialeah, I actually reconfirmed before I said the wrong statistic, and this may come into play later if we end up talking about the election, is Hialeah's census in 2010, we were 96% Latino. To put that in perspective, that is more Latino than if you combined everyone who is classified as white and black in New Orleans together. So it's very much a bubble. Spanish very much the first language, English only as necessary. Even the McDonald's, at least when I was younger, I don't know if this is still true, but the McDonald's would actually be in Spanish. Like they would have like dulce de leche Sundays, not caramel Sundays. But I grew up there and I did not leave Miami or go north of Fort Lauderdale for more than a week at a time until I was 22. I love Miami, but I didn't know, and it works both ways. Miami's a bubble. So I didn't know anything really about the rest of the United States, but also, as is clear over the last week of election analysis, or whatever you'd like to call it, I don't think a lot of the United States understood Miami either, and our demographics, and our peoples and how we relate and the differences and the idiosyncrasies. I started and I went to FIU, which is the public university over there. Just to continue with the Cubanness of Miami, my high school was named Felix Varela. which is a patriotic priest from Cuba. And I believe they changed it after some scandals, but FIU used to be on Jose Canseco Street, which was a Cuban baseball player who's notorious for lots of reasons. But yeah, I started, I don't think I knew I wanted to be a writer till I was in college. I knew I liked telling stories. I grew up wanting to be a basketball player. If we were in person, you would see that I'm 5'9" and I was not going to have a basketball career. You know, but we would be playing basketball as kids, and all my friends were from different places: Colombia, Dominican Republic, Spain. And between games, we were all very skinny and small. We would sit on green power boxes in front of the house and we would just trade stories. Three of us could fit on the box, one of us wouldn't. And that was like the beginning of me like formulating my own stories. Was like whoever wasn't on the box would kind of shoot, but would also like just tell stories, some true, some maybe embellished, you know. Uh, and that was kind of our way of communicating, you know. And both sides of my family are Cuban. My father was a Pedro Pan kid, which means that he came here as a child without any of his family. They had camps all throughout Miami at that time. It was a program that lasted about 2 years. In a kind of, just to connect it to present day, a lot of those camps were not being used until recently when this administration decided to open up camps for children. And that kind of opened up a lot of wounds down there, including for my father. My mother was born in the United States, but both of her parents, mis abuelos, were also habaneros, born from Havana. They also came in the 60s, during the aftermath of the revolution. But essentially, every Sunday we would all eat together and I would just hear stories of Cuba, this place I'd never been to. And part of home for me was being with them and hearing, me and my sister hearing stories of a place we've never been to that was their home, that they thought they would never, by the time we were born, they didn't think they'd ever go back to. And that has thus far still been true. And I think those things kind of led me to the oral, to like oral storytelling. That is like the beginning of what happened when I became an English major at FIU and I started writing for the school paper. After I graduated, I decided I wanted to travel a little bit. I thought I was cool and maybe I could like Jack Kerouac it up or, travel and go on the road. And so I came here at the age of 22 and I thought I was going to be here for 3 months. That did not happen. I am still here. I wish I could tell you there was like some scientific reason I came here, but honestly, I think it was just the first place that interested me that I can get to in a day. But there was something about the literary culture here and about the artistic inclinations that kind of drew me here. And so little by little, I ended up just, funny enough, my first house was on Valmont and Magazine in this office building. I was renting out a studio and I was on the first floor, and on the second floor right above me was Where You At Magazine's office. And that's actually how I got my first writing job, was paying the rent at the same time. And they needed help as an internship. Before you know it, I was writing for them every month, publishing something, including a piece on Cuba called The Crescent City Connection that talked about Cuba and New Orleans' history. The kind of intercambio they've had both before, during, and after, hopefully after the bloqueo, the embargo. I talked about not only the cultural connections like between Santiago de Cuba and New Orleans and Haiti, and how like food like camarones enchilado for me and mi abuela would be shrimp creole over here. But I also, explored organizations like Cuba Nola, that would send musicians back and forth between the two places to change. I realized through writing all that, all these people would come up to me and talk to me about how they didn't know any of this. And this kind of felt more like common knowledge to me in Miami. And so I started catching myself get more and more jobs revolved around writing about the Latino populace, even if it wasn't just Cuban. I ended up writing for Nola Defender, covering a lot of stories about undocumented peoples, partially because they didn't have anyone on staff who could speak Spanish, but also partially because I realized that in this city, the Latino population was so small and so many people were not trustworthy that we were able to, through shared experiences or understandings, I was able to garner trust in a way that others couldn't. So I started creating a journalistic career before even doing my spoken word poetry and my fiction, through writing about different situations as far as Cuban culture or undocumented peoples or different court cases involving Latinos or different events like Que Pasa Fest. And so I kind of went around, you know, little by little writing about that and exploring it. And not only was it helpful to like get information out there to people who didn't know these things, but it was also helpful to me because I had lived in Miami, which is, I would say, maybe the most like Latino city in the country. I don't want to like have like empirical data, but in a way that like it's taken for granted, or at least it was by me. And I feel like a lot of people like me who hadn't left, in that like we have access to like every group of people from Latin America. So, you know, like I'm used to being able to like, you know, switch or code switch to Colombian Spanish or Cuban Spanish or Dominican Spanish or, you know, Puerto Rican slang or whatever, you know, or like be able to go anywhere and try food from any of them, you know, if I want a different kind of empanada or whatnot. And so being able to examine that myself was very helpful by writing these articles and by, you know, exploring these things that I knew, but I really hadn't thought about what it meant to me to know these things and experience these things and grow up with these things. And then I started doing a little bit more poetry and fiction. This is how I met Carolina, but I started doing some poetry readings. That reading was actually all about, and Carolina did in the chat, send information on Pedro Pan, but it was about my father's experience as a Pedro Pan kid. It was interesting to be able to write that because by writing those poems, I was able to kind of interview my dad and find out information on Pedro Pan that I had never known before. It's not something that a lot of people like to talk about, you know, for obvious reasons. But being able to have an avenue or some reason with like an actual physical thing to achieve, I was able to ask him these questions and he opened up to me more than he had ever done before in that regard. And that became part of my like motivation to really go all in on writing, because I wanted to be able to tell these stories, and it was good for not only, I think, the community to have these stories told and not by someone who doesn't understand it, which we could look at once again, political analysis, which may be a reoccurring theme in but like today, but also like to be able to like examine it myself and like really kind of like deconstruct what I thought I knew or what I knew or what I understand or don't understand. And so I started writing poems that way. I started writing fiction exploring that. You know, I kind of was talking about how much oral stories, like with mis abuelos and my father, about Cuba, and also my friends who were all from different places, influenced me. But it wasn't until I started writing pieces and realizing what writing these pieces on Latinos did to me did I start reading more Latino lit. Because even in Miami, which is predominantly Latino town, I was still reading predominantly white American canon. So, you know, I read Catcher in the Rye, I think twice in high school, but I never read anything from Echio Bejas. I never read anything from Juno Diaz or Edwidge Dantica, the latter of which, you know, lives in Miami. And so we have like every excuse to you know, to read her books and to understand and to like examine those things. And so I started reading more Latino lit, including, you know, The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Juno Diaz was a book that won a Pulitzer, and they actually spoke Spanish kind of like how I did. They used slang that I used. They, you know, they spoke in like code and clipped and, you know, spoke Spanglish in ways that I had never seen before in any book, much less a book that won like, you know, the ultimate writing prize. And I started really kind of diving down. So I started reading more H.O. Bejas. I started reading more. That's so awesome. You're reading Juno Diaz. You know, which one, if you want me asking?
I'm a huge fan of combining Fiesta 1980 with A Cheater's Guide to Love.
Yes, that's so good. I'm sitting in on those classes. No, and like, so then I started really examining, Patricia Engel wrote a book beautiful about Miami and Havana and Cartagena in the Keys called The Veins of the Ocean. Chantel Acevedo wrote as a part of the University of Miami's writing program now, and she wrote The Distant Marvels that takes place a little outside of Santiago de Cuba. And I started reading and started like, correcting the canon that I had been given into something that was more influential and important for me. And it really kind of forced me and focused me to not only write more, even in my fiction, about like Latinos, but like really kind of keep the focus and lens on our peoples, because I think it was beneficial not only to me, but to our peoples, and then also to people outside of our communities who are not familiar with us, to read something, from the source, from us, not to read, not to watch Narcos and think that that's like, Latino, or not to watch, Scarface and, think Al Pacino did a good job, and so we did, so I just really started focusing on that. I started, I stopped italicizing my Spanish in my work, and I started just, I can't remember the last time that I wrote a protagonist that wasn't Latino or wasn't Caribbean or wasn't something similar to, that wasn't building off of something I've experienced or lived, and not because it was easy, but because I wanted to explore those things. And I thought it was important to explore those things. I think that exploration, if that exploration was done by more people, I don't think we'd have the mistakes we're seeing this week of people put the Latino bloc, quote unquote, all together. I think there's a reason why so many people didn't vote the way people thought they should. And it's because of that lack of communication and understanding of A, the fact that the Latino bloc essentially covers 3 continents, but then B, just like what each one of our groups as a people want. And I don't think either side really gets it right on any level, which is more disappointing on one side than the other, I suppose, without getting too deep down the politics of it. But so, yeah, I made a point to like always be aware and be cognizant, and to really read and write these experiences down, and to like use, to really examine the culture and the community in order to create these stories and these worlds to live in for both my friends and my community, but also for other people to come visit and see it from us. And so I kind of worked off those, through that, I kind of ended up finding community here that I didn't have my first few years in New Orleans. When I came to New Orleans, I was 22 and I didn't know anyone. And then I befriended 2 Latinos and they both left within the first year. And so I like didn't have anyone I could speak Spanish with, didn't have anyone I could communicate with or share with that would like, that I didn't have to explain, where I was coming from or what I was feeling, or like, explain my world before we get to the actual thing we want to talk about. But actually through my Where You At article on the Crescent City connection with Cuba, I ended up interviewing Hugo Montero, which is the owner of Casa Borrega. He was having a Cuba night there on Cuba. Every Friday, he was having a Cuban band play. And that became, I befriended Hugo, and I ended up interviewing him for countless stories. He is a great storyteller. And, and before you know it, I ended up catching myself with a community. I started building a community here that was a little bit more familiar to me. It wasn't as consistent or wasn't as deep or as easy to access as it was in Miami, but some of that also made me appreciate it more, that we had to like work to see each other, and like we had to be thicker for each other. And I can't say how many times I've been to Casa Borrega and run into people at the Stones, from the Stone Center, and we've all like had dinner and drinks in the before times, pre-COVID, and so it became, we all were kind of there for each other. And so like when Cubanola would have like their once a month music shows, like we would all catch ourselves being there, and for like 2 hours we would hear music and we would dance and drink and feel it for a second. And that became kind of a metaphor for what I wanted to do with my writing, where I wanted to create these worlds like those Cuban nights that you could live in for a couple of hours, for however long it takes, and like forget, that you're not embedded in that world consistently. And so that became pretty much like one of the main goals I have as a writer. And that became, how the Latino community influenced my writing in New Orleans, because I ended up, taking New Orleans storytelling, which is in and of itself its own beautiful thing, but then also with Latinos who have lived in New Orleans or were born in New Orleans or were raised in New Orleans, or like me, have just showed up here and experienced it and felt it. And, we all kind of crafted our stories to build a community for each other, but also to tell our stories to other people as well. And so, yeah, that became yeah. Sorry, I just got totally distracted by the question, which is a good question. So thank you, James. The question is, your perception of your present Cuban-American identity different than how you perceived your Cuban-American identity from your childhood? How has it changed socially? And, I'm very comfortable talking about politically too, but no.
James, that's a great question. I was about to ask that exact same thing.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you. And yeah, I think, I think the best way to explain it would be, when I was in Miami, I honestly thought I was like in the bottom 2 percentile of Cubans. Like, I just did not think, I thought, mi abuelo was very adamant that he was Cuban American and I was just American, that like by being here, I was just as American as John Wayne or Ryan Gosling or whoever it is that is America, and white America in particular, and so like, I, kind of believe that because I look like, everybody else in Miami. I didn't look any different. I didn't sound any different. I didn't have an accent, at least comparatively. And so when I got here, I went from like the 2 percentile of Cubans to like the 98th percentile. I all of a sudden caught myself, people would make comments that didn't bother me, but they did like strike me because it was so different than my previous experience of like how Cuban I was, or asking me questions, sometimes a little more factually based and sometimes a little bit more maybe stereotypically based, and or just confused, I guess, and so it really made me kind of, I think not only because I was younger as well, so, we're always going to push against, a little bit, I feel like, our parents and our upbringing when we're younger. So part of me also was probably coming back a little bit to Cuban identity just by, growing older. But then part of it was also just to realizing that, yeah, when I got here, I didn't realize that like people didn't, eat black beans and rice every day, play dominoes, didn't know how to say the word mojito, like there was like so many things that like, and those are obvious examples, but there were so many things that were taken for granted that, I think, it really kind of accentuated these aspects of my identity, and, some things that I was happy to change because there's so many things I love about New Orleans and, I wanted to experience and I took and owned as my own, but then also so many things that I wanted to keep where I was like, no, I have to like make a conscientious effort to speak more Spanish or to cook more of the recipes mi abuela or my mother taught me when I was younger, or to tell more stories and to write more Latino-ness that I wasn't doing when I was in Miami for various reasons. So it really did change my perception of myself as a Cuban American. And then politically, and I'm going to try to censor my answers before I say some of them, but no, politically, I think like I understood where, I was not politically active or conscious or aware at all. I have covered politics a lot since I've been in New Orleans. I've grown to very much feel comfortable speaking politically. I've been doing political posts for the last 72 hours, analyzing the polls or whatnot. And so I think like, and I follow it. I was doing none of that in Miami. I'd be lying if I told you I was. And I think, but I think I understood the politics of Miami a little bit where I was like, okay, I understood, single issue voting, I guess we could say, of like the Cubans who wanted to be hard on Cuba or go back to Cuba or um, absolving their vote because of the hurt they experienced. And I never questioned that because I understood the hurt and I heard the hurt and I had seen the hurt and what it did to people. But I don't think I fully understood the ramifications of the politics of Miami and how it's different than the rest of the country. I think Miami very much, for better or worse, is a bubble. And when we're in Miami, we maybe enjoy that, kind of like New Orleans can be a bubble from Louisiana. But that means that people don't understand Miami very well. Look at all the punditry of the last 72 hours. But I think it also means that we don't understand the country as well. And so I remember being on a trip with a relative of mine, and we went to Sanibel Island, which is like maybe 2 hours north of Miami, a little to the west. And it was a little beach. And we went there, and my relative was really struck back by how she was treated when she asked for something at a gas station. And I think my family had not expected, or this member of my family had not expected to, be treated that way, because they had not left their neighborhood in Miami, much less Miami itself, in so long. But that person still votes in a way that I think puts not only they themselves, but also me and my sister and a lot of us at risk because of the lack of awareness of what the rest of the country looks like and what the rest of the country feels like politically. And so I understood to question the single issue voting of Cubans in particular, but also question just in general, how politics works in this country. Because not only, do I come from a community that very much comes and votes passionately, because we can't vote, we don't vote in Cuba, but so we take that right passionately and we vote in numbers that overwhelm other demographics, but also that because we vote so emotionally, and we don't necessarily go through other parts of the country, I feel like we don't we don't understand the repercussions of our vote. And so I think I was much more aware of that after I left and saw what not only politics, but race and culture and community and government looks like when you leave Miami, and that's without even getting into just how corrupt the city Miami is in and of itself. That's just speaking strictly from, the Cuban perspective. And yeah, so it definitely changed me a lot. I mean, to be 100% blunt, I have never voted for a Republican, but I think I was more forgiving I was more understanding, which is not a bad thing. But also, as I left, I realized how understanding also meant having difficult conversations with my family, because you can understand and not condone this. You can understand and also not agree with and want to, and have to unpack and discuss these things. And so, yeah, it opened me up politically that way, and I feel like I get more and more political. And in some ways, what they have that adage where as you get older, you get more conservative, but they have that meme, right, where it's but I keep sliding to the left. I feel like in some ways politically, that's me, where I'm understanding more things. And because of that, I'm catching myself changing what I was more indifferent of when I was younger into more impassioned now. And yeah, that's the shortest I think a Cuban descended person will ever speak about politics, but I think I wrapped it up somewhat, hopefully cogently.
Yeah, you did that. You did absolutely great. I think it's really interesting, Chris. I mean, we briefly talked about Cubans and the Cuban exile community, and the day we were going to talk about Achi and Ana is the day that the class was canceled because of the hurricane, right? But and I love hearing you, because I didn't grow up in Miami. As a Cuban-American, there were no Latinos in Columbus, Georgia. We were there was only one other Cuban family, and they were Baptist, and my parents thought it was weird that they weren't Catholic, so we weren't allowed to hang out with them that much. And then when I'd go to Miami, I'd go into this enclave, right? And I was the outsider. And even though I was Cuban American, I just didn't understand things, with my cousins. A lot of times I went away for college, they stayed there, right? Like all these different things and I've always had a difficult relationship with Miami myself because I've always felt like an outsider there. An insider outsider, right? Because I love going there. And when he talked about code switching, right? That wonderful being able to speak Spanglish, walking into the Walgreens and just going at Spanglish without even thinking about it is the most beautiful thing in the world, right? And also it was always nice for me after growing up in Columbus, Georgia, and people of course would speak to me in English, and sometimes they would ask me what language, they would speak to me in English, but it was really nice being recognized as Latina or Cuban American. In Miami, people would automatically speak to me in Spanish. I would like you, if you don't mind, and there's another question here. There's not another question, but how about returning to Cuba, the politics of return? Because you've done 2 trips, but your first trip back to Cuba was relatively recently, and you've done 3, and the politics of return and what that means in Miami, because it means something different in Miami than it means in the rest. Because everybody else is like, "Oh, have you been to Cuba?" is always the first question somebody asks you if you say you're Cuban American, and in Miami, they don't want to know if you've been back to Cuba, right? Because that's a betrayal. So the politics of return, how does that fit into your literature, right? And lots of other things. And I think it's interesting how you became perhaps even more Cuban American living here in New Orleans, which I find very interesting. So go ahead. Sorry.
All right, I'll work backwards if you don't mind. But I think, I ended up becoming more Cuban American, I think partially because I was filling in the space that I was finally given for my identity. I think in Miami, there's so much Cuban and Cuban Americanness that I didn't actually have space to explore that and see what that felt like. And once I got to New Orleans and that was no longer around, I was able to kind of explore that in my own way and, use what I'd been taught or what I'd been around and what I felt and what I experienced, what I grew up with, and use it in the way I wanted to without all these generations of Cubans around and, different perspectives and gazes and what have you. Returning to Cuba, always an easy question. No, returning to Cuba, it's, I've went 3 times.
And it's funny, I'm using returning to Cuba because neither you nor I were born in Cuba, but when we go to Cuba, it is returning to Cuba.
100%,
right?
100%. Right. And it's, I hadn't even thought of that. Yeah, I am saying returning to Cuba, I think it's interesting. Mi abuelo, who did not know about my first 2 trips until after the fact. My mother did not want me to tell them because of the hurt, the pain, the fear of their reaction. They are older. But I remember when I came back this last time, which was a trip that I was with you, Carolina, I ended up coming back and we actually saw some old family we hadn't had contact with in forever. And we got to meet them, including relatives we didn't even know existed. And when talking to Abuelo about that, and this kind of fits into my stories, right? And why the importance I think of these stories, I remember mi abuelo just telling me I had not thought of that in so long. You kind of opened the gates to Cuba for me again. And I think that's part of what I feel like is the return. I think even though me nor my sister were born there and hadn't been there till, in my case, my mid-20s, I think it felt like a return because it felt like we were going to these places that we had heard about all our lives and we had built in our heads, we would, Sunday mornings, you would watch a Disney film, but then you would end the night with arroz con frijoles negro and stories of Cuba, and those were the 2 worlds you experienced, And so then going there, it felt like I had heard about this place all my life, and from a nostalgia Cuban sensibility, but also from the similarities to New Orleans. I remember walking down in Centro Havana, and it was December 17th, which is Dia de San Lázaro. I can't even say the name, Lazarus. And so out of nowhere, just hearing like drums in the distance, and it felt like I was like creeping up on a Mardi Gras Indian parade, and so it felt like all these experiences I had in my life led up to like going to Cuba. And it does feel like, it is different because, from one side, if I talk to, some people who are American will like ask me, they want to know like what bars or what, kind of like innocuous, simple questions like what's a good bar, what's a good restaurant, what's a whatever, they want you to be their Cuban Yelp, but then there's also, in Miami, they don't want to know. And if they do know, some people, and this is a generalization, but a lot of people don't want to know. And if, they do find out, some people have visceral reactions. I've had people tell me they didn't want to talk to me because I went back to Cuba. And so there's like a hurtful wound there, which I think is really well explored in Ana Menendez's In Cuba I Was a German Shepherd, where it talks about like the nostalgia of Cuba and what happens when you go there and you deconstruct it, and what happens when you deconstruct someone else's nostalgia, someone else's like dreams of their old home. And I think there's a lot of that in Miami, but then it's the opposite. I've traveled a good bit through South America as well. And like I would go to Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil. And like if they found out, if it came up that I was Cuban-American and then that I went to Cuba, like people would be so curious, it's a place that really intrigues a lot of people. And so I would end up, it's interesting how all those things can be true. And yet it kind of, in some ways, is interesting that people are so curious, and yet we still have, as a country, very little understanding, it seems like, or consciousness or awareness of Cuba. But that also that people are still curious, but, you look at it and there's not only the punditry, but like even how like the political campaigns talk to Cubans in Miami, like you can see the lack of communication and awareness and understanding of that community I come from, and both through multiple generations, all of which are different. And so yeah, like it's going to Cuba became something. I remember the first time I went to Cuba, I wasn't able to really even talk to my dad about it, so I would like write letters, and it became a way that I can like write and create a framing and send something to him that was controlled, and that he could read it calmly on his own, controlled. And the interactions built up until like I was able to like show him a picture of his old house, or go check out a park he used to go to as a kid. And then the same thing happened where then before you know it, I was taking cab rides with my sister to see mi abuelita's old house in Santos Suarez, which was off the a little farther away from our casa particulares where we were staying, and so these things built up little by little by like writing letters and writing my stories about this. I've written about San Lázaro, I've written about experiences in Cuba, and like it became a way of like putting my story out there in a way that can be framed that I think would be good to advance conversations within our own community, but also to like, let people outside experience it a little bit, as much as they can, on the levels they can connect with. But yeah, that's every time I go to Cuba, like it is difficult because it is a place with a lot of hurt for my family, but it also feels very important and powerful and strong and empowering. And I miss it the second I'm on the airplane. But yeah, it is something that very deeply affects my writing because of so much of like that, chosen trauma, which is like the concept that like genetically trauma is passed down to you from like, prior generations. And I think that's, writing and exploring that is so important, not only for Cubans, but for so many Latino Americans who were exiled or left their countries or had to migrate or whatever vernacular, you feel comfortable using. And I think that is something that has really become a major theme in all my writing, my essays, my fiction, my poetry.
Great. Any other questions for Christopher? Yeah, and inherited or whatever you called it, trauma is very much a real thing, for sure. Yeah. For sure. Christopher, would you be willing to read a little something to us? Like the
Sure.
beginning of something? Would you be willing to do that? And we can kind of close out in that kind of way. Would y'all be interested in hearing that? Okay.
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind, I was actually looking at something to read, and I think I like the last like page of a poem about Miami, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, that would be great. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, this is just a piece I got about growing up in Miami, and it kind of talks a lot about the less good things, but then it kind of somewhat. Here's a piece I read back when we used to go to bars. I used to read it. You remember how Abuelo calls you just American, as if in charge of labeling for this country, as if you can tell the cops while you're in midair as they tossed you into a fence on your walk home from school that no, 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 it's okay, I was born in the States. As if mission is complete in Americanization because you were born in Hialeah. And they still drink to next year in Cuba, a ritual like a pitcher going up to bat who keeps tapping the corners of the plate, even though he never hits the damn ball. And it just makes those moments that much sweeter when the music takes over and everyone lets go of the anger and dances. At Hoy Como Ayer, a bar named for those still in the past, the bouncer, the best dressed person at the club, dressed to the nines, tape fixed an hour before his shift, the band starting late but always on time, the tambura player so drunk that two honorary members of the band have to bring a chair up and place him on it, tuning his balance to the seat, El Viejito hiding his intoxication behind the shades and a sombrero, dancing in his chair as if possessed. And you remember the 03 series, the Marlins winning it all, and in Hialeah, your hometown, people take to the streets with pots and pans. Everything a percussion instrument for us. And you make a street parade that channels Santiago de Cuba. Calle Ocho closes as if it was a back road in Pinar del Rio. People from Alamar are rapping all over it, and I-75 is now a parking lot. For no exit here contains people who wouldn't jump out of the car to join, because there is no exit in sight for the people who are here. So they dance as they only know how, the only revolution afforded to them, and La Lucha Forever in Miami.
Chris, that's wonderful. And any last questions, y'all? No? All right. Well, Christopher, thank you very much for your time, for your sage words, for your experiences. And thank all of y'all for being here. You got my office hours there. Have any questions, please let me know. If not, good luck tomorrow with the exam. Thanks, y'all.